Good day and welcome to our 2018 webinar speaker series hosted by the International Society for Industrial Ecology. My name is Mai Ichihara and I will be your host for today's webinar titled Big Coupled Data for Sustainable Urban Systems, Examples from Los Angeles. The ISIE webinar series invites leading researchers from various fields to talk about the latest opportunities and developments in industrial ecology. In today's webinar, we will explore the potential of big data to guide new policies for sustainable urban communities. Here with us is our speaker for today, Dr. Stephanie Pincetl. Stephanie Pincetl is a professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, and director of the California Center for Sustainable Communities at UCLA. She is an expert in bringing together interdisciplinary teams across the biophysical and engineering sciences and social sciences to address problems involving complex urban systems and environmental management. Dr. Pincetl has written extensively about land use in California, environmental justice, habitat conservation efforts, and water and energy policies. She has received funding from the National Science Foundation to research urban ecology and water management in Los Angeles, and her book, Transforming California: The Political History of Land Use in the State, is a defining study of California's land use politics and policies. Before we begin, we would like to remind our listeners that we welcome any questions you might have, and I will direct them to our speaker towards the end of the talk. Throughout the presentation, please type questions directly into the Zoom Q&A window, which is not to be mistaken with the one labeled chat. And with that, we welcome Dr. Stephanie Pincetl.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Hi, Melanie. It's nice to have you on. I'm very pleased to be able to present some of the work that we've been doing in Los Angeles and to try to put it in the context of of how you address complex urban systems with big data. Next, please. So we know that complex urban systems and global environmental change are integrally connected, and that the challenge of the 21st century is really to reduce Earth system impacts of human activities. And that really tends to be rethinking how cities are organized and how they are sustained, because they are now, as we know, the new homes of humanity. So more people live in cities than ever before, which is a dramatic change in our relationship to nature. And they're the primary drivers of change. So how they evolve is really key. And we begin to realize that there are enormous gaps in our understanding of the relationship between cities and those global environmental impacts. So things like data on material and other flows really are it's not very well documented about where and how much stuff comes into cities, how it's mined, how it's processed. And then the waste sinks that these material flows, once we've run through them in the city, where are all those waste sinks going? We know there's air pollution, we know there's water pollution, we know that there's recyclables and trash, but we don't really have a full understanding of those relationships. And even more difficult, pardon me, Mai, is Mai is advancing these. Can you go back one, please? Is how they relate to socio-institutional factors. So we can do, in a sense, a kind of physical analysis, tracking flows, hard enough as it is, but then how does that interact, or how is it driven, or how does it affect socio-institutional factors is yet another problem that we have to begin to unpack. Next, please. So the other kinds of things that I think are really important to consider when you're doing this work is that data is not a neutral thing. Data doesn't just exist. It has to be driven with and by new kinds of questions in order to be able to think about their implications for greater sustainability. So are cities designed, or are they not designed? How are they designed? Do planners design them? Is it a ground-up system? Or is it just topsy-turvy with people migrating to cities and squatting? Those are very important questions to understand, and they affect really how infrastructure is developed and the kinds of resource flows they depend upon. Associated with that is the question of regulations. If you don't have a sense of the regulatory infrastructure of a city, you really don't understand how and why it develops the way it is. and where infrastructure systems are developed and redeveloped and under what assumptions. Is it a modernist city with codified rules about the size of pipes and size of roads and depth of roadbed and so on? That is a whole way of thinking about a city and drives resource flows and greenhouse gas emissions and much more. Urban morphology, if your road has to be such and such a width, then you have probably lots of room devoted to a road that has lots of implications for sustainability. So it raises then the issue of what material flows do cities rely upon? Are they far flung or are they nearby? We know that sand for concrete is generally preferably mined nearby and processed nearby. As sand becomes more and more scarce, we have to go farther and farther for it. That has enormous implications for greenhouse gas emissions and also the increasing scarcity of sand. So what the material flows are becomes a very, very important constitution of those urban areas. Again, the waste streams, what are they? Where do they go? We are beginning in the West, at least, to recycle concrete and recycle asphalt, but still there's much, much more waste than those building infrastructures, and how we dispose of them, if we dispose of them, if we don't just put them in the landfill, becomes a really important sustainability question. There are social questions about who lives in the cities, under what conditions, is wealth concentrated, or is there little inequality? I just read in the paper this morning that our neighbor to the south of Los Angeles, Orange County, doesn't want its homeless people. It is refusing to allow housing to be built and camps to be built that are organized for homeless people. That creates a whole set of environmental conditions that are really important for sustainability. And then probably one of the most important aspects of cities going forward is their hydrocarbon-based fuel dependence. So if you think about the cities that exist today, the large cities that exist today, and you imagine the removal of hydrocarbons from those cities' processes, how do they work? Food is imported. That a city of 10 million people imports 3,000 pounds of food a day that comes from over 1,000 miles. Remove hydrocarbons from that, and those cities have a really big problem supplying themselves. So that becomes a very, very significant question as we move forward in thinking about how you use data and what data means in terms of the future sustainability of those cities. And then finally, we know that there are cities growing and there are cities that are shrinking. Why are they growing? Why are they shrinking? Why are they growing in some places and not other places? This will tell you a lot about how to think of the future relative to our living in those cities. Next one. So my research motivation here is to understand the resource flows, how they're used, where, by whom, to do what, and to try to couple that up with regulatory regime analysis. So as I mentioned, there are all kinds of rules that are really important to understand to help then cities reduce their environmental impacts more equitably. If the transportation department requires you to build a roadbed that is thick like this or thick like this, and is not willing to entertain new building materials, then you have a really difficult transition facing you. And so we need to really understand how that regulatory regime constrains the ability of cities to change. So we need to quantify flows, we need to quantify consumption, we need to understand these regulatory regime and assess the social environmental impacts of the cities close by and within the cities, and then begin to try to develop policies, programs, and implementation strategies for change. Okay, next, please. And these flows, as I've alluded to, are the result of many drivers: rules, regulations, conventions, profit seeking, that combine with the ability of cheap energy, cheap resources to shape production and consumption and urbanization patterns. We have to really grapple with the fact that hydrocarbon energy is really cheap still, even though we know it's a catastrophe in terms of our impacts on the climate, and it's, using hydrocarbon energy poisons the soil, poisons water, poisons the body, but it's really cheap. It's extremely powerful, and it avails us of resources in a cheap manner. So we're facing a very, very difficult transition going forward, but we need to really understand the embeddedness of that carbon energy in our activities. Next. And that these flows are driven by social decisions, economic decision making by the firm or the sector, shaped by trade agreements, fiscal agreements, and subsidies. If you look at what banks will loan on, the insurance industry and all of that, really shape decisions about investments, extraction, manufacturing. And we need to understand those as the shapers of these material flows, of the metabolism of cities. And so these drivers translate into global environmental change. That it's still cheaper to build on the urban fringe in the United States than it is for infill, is a very significant economic question relative to curbing environmental impacts. And so then the challenge is really to develop this parallel metabolism of the social, economic, regulatory regimes to the physical urban metabolic system. And I would argue that it's a lot harder to develop the social, economic, regulatory regimes because there's history to those, there's culture, there's politics, and the physical urban metabolic system is really far more of a quantification. And then even though the data sources are not easily found, at least it's a fairly straightforward kind of analysis. So we can, and then marrying the two to construct the relationship to urbanization patterns is really the ultimate challenge. Next. All of this is under this umbrella of the idea of sustainability. And it's kind of paradoxical that despite the idea of urban sustainability as a goal for cities and the rise of sustainability science and how it's been mainstreamed, everybody, sustainability is a fairly well accepted concept, there are still no sustainable cities and no context for what it might be. I mean, if there was a sustainable city, would you know what it is? And so it's a kind of moving target, and I think we still have not well grappled with what it means for cities and research going forward. So it's a very challenging concept, and I propose that specific and granular data about city processes can help advance sustainability in a kind of specific way. Next. And so this is a kind of recapitulation slide of what I've said, trying to understand the microglobal system of networks and economic transactions and agreements that really shape the particular processes that happen in the specific place. So LA, we have an enormous port. Not all cities have an enormous port, or regions have an enormous port. So we become the portal of importation for the rest of the country. That shapes this city in a particular region in a special way, including air pollution. And we have to unpack how these urban systems are woven into the larger networks and how the different cities are imbricated in those systems, because that also affects whether they're going to grow or whether they're going to shrink, whether they're going to attract immigrants or not, the kinds of jobs that there are. And so it has to be highly local and specific to grapple and understand how they resource themselves and how they manage the urbanization processes and the pressures that they face from these global systems that are kind of amorphous, but certainly very, very powerful. And the research has to be obviously interdisciplinary. And as I've said, it has to really include history and culture and politics and economics, finance and government and governance factors. In fact, it is a whole discipline in itself. Next. But as we've discovered in our work here, data availability, even for some of the most prosaic things, as you'll see with the work that I'll present to you, is a big obstacle, because a lot of the important data is considered private, especially when controlled by private companies. Like utility data is controlled by the utilities, and so it becomes really difficult to know how much energy buildings are using, even though it is a kind of fundamental question in reducing energy use going forward. And often the data is seen in these silos, limiting their effectiveness because you can't see the cross connections. Go ahead. So I'm going to show you, turning to our granular work, not that I claim that this is work that is going to really provide a comprehensive view of the Los Angeles region, but it is a building block that I think can be replicated in other parts of the country and potentially in different parts of the world, that helps you really ground some of these questions about where cities are going and sustainability, and the kinds of context of regulation and history of the development of infrastructure that is important to really begin to understand. So we have developed an interactive web atlas that provides access to what we think is probably the largest and most disaggregated building energy data available in the nation. Next. So this tool that we're going to work you through very briefly provides knowledge about building energy use with individual building data for electricity and natural gas. It provides the ability to quantify need, target programs, and evaluate results. So in California, for example, there's a goal to reduce energy use in buildings by 50%. But without a tool like the Atlas, you don't know how much energy buildings do use. So it'd be like going to a car lot and wanting to buy a car and having all kinds of cars there and no information on how much gas they use. Just kind of a notional idea that bigger cars probably use more gas and smaller cars use less gas, but you don't actually know how much gas they use. So the building stock is kind of like that today. And with building energy data, you can actually meet state or national legislation, you can target conservation programs, you can look for greenhouse gas reductions possibilities, and you can just improve the quality of life as well, and begin to see environmental justice or inequality in the landscape by having actual ground up data. Next. So what we have is through a non-disclosure agreement with the Public Utilities Commission of California, we've obtained investor-owned utility billing data for electricity and natural gas for all of Los Angeles County, which I'll show you here. And we will be adding data for all of the Southern California region to this atlas by June or so, up to 2016. So we have 27 plus million raw utility addresses that we have geocoded to the parcel level. And because of the way property taxes are assessed in California, at least, they're assessed by the county assessor. And the county assessor has a vast database about the age of the buildings, their size, their use type, and so on, that permit the county assessor to determine the value of that property. So we geocode to the location and we match the data to building attributes. We add to that in the residential area, the census characteristics, including renter owner, And you'll see with the atlas, we do it by income bracket and so on. And then we have other geographical aggregations as well, block groups, neighborhoods, city councils. You can actually aggregate this data in a number of different ways. Next, please. So I'll just give you a little bit of background on how this works. We have the billing data, the county assessor parcels, the census, the administrative boundaries. We're including weather data now. We have a solar prioritization tool that I'll explain very briefly a little bit later. And then we put this all in a big database, relational database that organizes account level energy consumption and the spatial relations. We create aggregation. We aggregate this into statistical analysis, and then those aggregations get exported to the website because there's a very strong concern in Californian rules about aggregation of building energy data in order to protect privacy of the customer. But you can still tell a lot about building energy use across space and time through the aggregation rules that are very specific, but are targeted so that you can't reverse engineer to figure out whose house or building that you're referring to. Next, please. So we're going to show you this very quickly. This is Atlas 1.0, and as I said, Atlas 2.0 is going to be out fairly soon. And in the map view, I will just show you Los Angeles County, and it's a very easy website to access. And you can see that there's a key for all the building types and a color for the different types, so residential, commercial, industrial, and so forth. And then there's a scroll bar that says show me. And then if you click on all building types, you'll see there's a drop-down table. So you can query by building type: residential, commercial, industrial, institutional. And then in the next category over, you can see, you can query by combined consumption, electricity consumption, natural gas, greenhouse gas emissions, which are very important in California because local governments have to begin to report greenhouse gas emissions by the building sector. And then as a total, and this becomes really interesting as a research tool, median per parcel, median per square foot, residential per capita. And then finally, you can query by city, by council of government, and by neighborhoods. LA is big, and there are like 272 neighborhoods or something like that. So we'll go down to Los Angeles County, and if you click open full profile on the bottom, you can see the major consumption and summary statistics in terms of population and so on, median household income. You can see, if you scroll down a little bit farther, that therms are much higher use than electricity, and by building type, using the colors above to indicate the kind of building it is, the use type. And then you can see single family, multiple family, and the kind of, whoops, a little bit too fast, a little bit, go back up. Perfect. The built space per square foot of the different use types, the median consumption per square foot, and then going down a little bit farther, you can see it by building vintage. Some of it is masked because of protecting customer privacy. We can have a discussion about that later if you'd like. Building space per square foot by year, tranches, median consumption per square foot. You can see that pre-1950 buildings are far less energy efficient than post-1990 buildings. And then if you scroll down a little bit farther, it'll tell you residential consumption by income, a renter owner, a population by median household income, and then finally the consumption by building size at the bottom, because there's a reporting requirement by the state for commercial buildings over a certain size. So that gives you just a little flavor of the kinds of data that we have collected in order to be able to facilitate research. And so the Energy Atlas, as you can see here, is this kind of hub for energy efficiency program evaluation, county scale, and solar prioritization, as I'll show you in a second. You can do project site energy analyses. You can do, you can cut and slice and dice this information, still protecting customer privacy, because there's so much of it. You can begin to really ask some questions. And then we are, I'll talk a little bit about the water data in a bit. So next. So I'm going to show you an application. We got a grant from the California Energy Commission to accelerate the deployment of advanced energy communities, which essentially means moving towards distributed generation for solar, for solar electrification, and under the disadvantaged community category. Next. And here's the site. It's in, if any of you know Los Angeles, it's in unincorporated East LA, a kind of neglected spot by former landfills, bisected by freeways and surrounded by freeways, classically underserved neighborhood. Next. And what we were able to do with the Atlas is really derive all these land use types and begin to understand exactly in this area what the square foot counts are, which really then inform the amount of solar capacity there are on the building roofs, and gives you a very strong sense of the neighborhood. Next. We derive from the Energy Atlas the average total monthly electricity consumption by category. So we understand who the highest energy users are and whether the energy use varies a lot throughout the year. Next. And then we did an analysis to try to determine whether there was enough rooftop on site to supply demand. And what we have discovered is that there is not to mention that many of these homes are rentals, and their roof may or may not be adequately well built or newly re-roofed to support solar. And so that entrains a whole set of other questions, like where, if you want to electrify, do solar, renewable energy in this area, where do you put the solar? And so we are working very closely with the county to identify county sites and school sites where there's enough rooftop, where we could create a virtual solar community by utilizing these other available resources and not rely on the roofs of the inhabitants directly. Next. So this solar prioritization tool depicts the amount of energy versus natural gas used in each building, and the solar capacity for replacing current energy use, the grid potential. Now this becomes something that we are now developing, because it's not enough to have rooftop, you have to be able to transport that energy. And the utilities in California only allow solar up to 15% penetration of their actual grid. And so that's a considerable limitation. We show that current energy use, as I mentioned, electricity and natural gas may not be able to be addressed on on-site solar. In fact, the funding source that we have will not allow us to electrify the natural gas side as well in this analysis. And then, as I said, we're looking at parking lots and other urban lands. And this kind of analysis then illuminates a whole set of implications for land use and other, and potentially, if you want to transition to renewables, natural lands elsewhere. Next. So here's the way in which we have developed this tool. It's on our website, so if you're interested, we have the grid capacity on one side. On the bottom left is the CalEnviro screen, which is a tool that the state of California developed to show where the most disadvantaged communities are in terms of income and pollution burden. The net solar potential that is on the top right, and then census and demographics on the bottom. And using these four analytic lenses, we can begin to really tell a story about where solar should be prioritized. Next. The other thing that we did was we were able to get energy efficiency program data from the utilities through, again, non-disclosure agreement, because we are concerned that while there's $1 billion spent annually in California on energy efficient upgrades, we don't know very much about what works and what doesn't work, because most of the data analysis is done with model data. And so a lot of the models show much greater savings than exist actually. And so we wanted to be able to really do a deep dive into that. And next. We wanted to also begin to understand patterns of adoption from a social justice perspective. And not only is the adoption rate for those $5 billion, that $1 billion, which you kind of wonder where the money goes, is very low, but in low-income communities, it's even lower. And what we're able to discern by doing an analysis of the whole county and all of the effectiveness programs that were implemented is that the patterns of adoption show that people in newer houses, which are already more energy efficient, tend to apply for them. They tend to be owners. They live in neighborhoods with higher incomes and lower population densities. They're mostly white and higher educated. So we're still working on this, on these statistical models, but we show that if you want to transition low-income neighborhoods to greater energy efficiency, there's a whole hell of a lot of work to be done. Next. Oh, okay. All right, so in summary for this energy work that we've been doing on buildings, some of the things that we found by just mining the energy atlas itself, beyond the specific application that I just told you about, is that lower income people live in smaller, less well-built houses. Well, surely that's not a surprise, but unless you can really mine big data, you can assert that kind of thing, but you can't say a lot about it. And so we have found that higher income people use 11 times more energy per capita than low income households. Now, what we find is that per square foot, those houses of the more high income people are much more energy efficient per square foot than in the low income households with smaller houses. But because the houses are so much bigger, they wipe out the savings of the state energy efficiency codes for construction. And so it really raises, in my mind, some very significant questions relative to energy efficiency regulations, right? This is where understanding the regulation relative to the data becomes very interesting. If the state had simply said you can't build big houses, say no house can be more than 2,000 square feet, probably we would have saved more energy than the money expended for all of the energy efficiency built into these big houses that get overwhelmed simply by the size. So it's a really, really interesting paradox. We find, as I just mentioned, that voluntary and partially subsidized EE, energy efficiency programs really are not enough, as energy efficiency programs tend to work not so well, especially for low-income populations. Gas use is higher than electricity. Grid upgrades, which we've done a fair amount of work now looking at, tend to be more prevalent in wealthier neighborhoods. So if you want to solarize low-income neighborhoods, they don't have as much grid capacity, so they're caught by the 15% penetration regulation and may not be able to actually implement as much solar conversion as wealthier neighborhoods. Another very interesting paradox. That the regional energy use is higher than local rooftop energy potential, and that ultimately the existing building stock is a huge challenge for energy use reduction, and that's what we have the most of is old buildings. Next. So they raise all these results raise enormously important questions for the regulatory framework that lacks currently statewide data for implementation. And that there's really insufficient funding available for large-scale change. We are very skeptical that California can achieve existing building energy use reductions at 50% by 2030 through incentives alone. So then what does that mean for state policy? You can pass legislation, but if you don't have the money to make the transformation and you're relying on individuals who live in crappy buildings to do it themselves, probably it's not going to happen very smoothly. What is the potential for local energy sustainability? We don't think that there's enough, probably, and I hate to say it actually, solar potential in town, in the urbanized area, to meet demand without big changes in the building stock and in consumption. So these are really, really big findings, I think, if you're wanting to move cities to greater sustainability, and they point to the need for changes in habits as much as building stock. Next. So I want to talk to you very briefly about water as well, and then we'll open it up for some questions. California, yes, suffers from either too much water or not enough water. Those of you who are not from California probably know that water is moved across California and in from the Colorado River, but here's a map. These are highly complex systems, very built in the 20th century, based on assumptions about snowpack and so on, that really moves the water from north to south and east to west, and is composed of surface water supply, groundwater, which is depleted quite considerably in the Central Valley, where most agricultural activity is. There's a lot of flood control infrastructure as well, a great deal of urban stormwater that generally goes out to sea, and then there's the wastewater piece as well. Next. We had a National Science Foundation grant under the, let's see, sustainable, I've forgotten the category. In any event, we spent about 5 years trying to really dissect the urban water system in LA County. And it had never actually been done, oddly enough. And we really tried to, and we did actually, do a comprehensive analysis of who delivers water where, and the kinds of water delivering entities that exist, the groundwater resource and how it is managed, and basins and subbasins, the stormwater management agencies, the wastewater management agencies, and so on. And it's a remarkable system of 200 plus private and public retailers, for example. And the system is really this historical system that evolved over time, where urban growth took place, a water delivering entity got created, and then it moved on as the region grew. And because there was quite a bit of water, and the state and the federal government built water delivery infrastructures, everything has worked pretty well until more recently, when we realized that the snowpack of the state upon which all of this is really predicated is not going to be there in the next, by the end of the century. And so it causes us to really have to rethink how this urban water system, I believe, is organized and what some of the implications are for water use. Next. So we built Los Angeles Water Hub. It's a public website with all of the water providers. We have water use per capita as much as possible, but it's not reported it's only started to be reported actually at the state level. And what we can do here, we have a map function again. We really like maps. And I want to show you the center piece here, the center screen, water suppliers, where you can scroll, you can see on the right-hand side the different kinds of water delivering entities. So it's a kind of head spinning number: municipal water districts, mutual water companies, city retailers, investor-owned utilities, this accreted system. And then with the key, then you can go and scroll over the map and choose a city or a entity, and you can see, and we're updating this currently, supply and demand in 2010. We're continuing to update this more recently. The total water supply, how much is imported, how much is groundwater, how much is recycled, the population, the connections, the total reported demand, and where it's available, residential consumption per day. So it's the only thing that exists out there. And some places, let's scroll up a little bit higher, click on the X, no, I'm sorry, back to LA, the county, and see the little tiny X on the city of Torrance? Click it, okay. So if you go to Compton, which is right in the center of the screen, there you go. Okay, so you can see this is not at all a wealthy city, and the residential per capita per day is 56 gallons. And in different parts of the county, you have many, many different kinds of suppliers. That has implications for the ability of those suppliers, because if they're really small, to upgrade their water infrastructure and so on. So in any event, this is another example of how putting together big data can begin to inform communities about the situation that they are in on the ground, and we can put it together. If you move to the back to the slideshow, in different ways. And what we've been working on is trying to integrate this together to tell a new story about water availability in the region, and being able to move towards a greater water independence future. So we need to know landscapes and outdoor water use. We've been working with ecologists who have measured outdoor vegetation's water use. We have urban runoff and the imported water supplies. We have, as you can see, you saw there, all of the institutions, and then putting together the regulations, the finances, and so on, and then the engineered systems as well. Next, please. And we developed this systems model to integrate the data to understand the current system. It's a publicly available model called ARTES, A-R-T-E-S. It's on our website. And you can see it's a network model that quantifies each one of these pieces of the water system. Next. And so we can ask the question, what would a water efficient city look like, with certain kinds of assumptions? And we assumed 50 gallons per capita per day, as we saw in Compton. That's what people use. We utilized the tree canopy water needs of trees that are much more appropriate to the region and efficient landscapes. We assumed commercial and industrial water conservation, and most importantly, the conjunctive use of groundwater as a common property resource across the county. Next. And we found that in nearly water sufficientness scenarios, where stormwater capture increases by 300%, reuse increases by 25%, and an overall demand of 100 gallons per person per day, and so that includes the commercial and industrial, that actually the county could become nearly water self-reliant, importing water through those big water systems every several years when the state receives very high water fall, so high precipitation years. So we know that with climate change going forward, it's not that there isn't going to be any precipitation. It's just that it's going to be much more intense, much more episodic, and that there will be years where there's be very little precipitation. So if we import water and fill the groundwater up, basins up, and they're underutilized at this point, and increase stormwater capture and so on, the region can really get by with quite a bit less water importation year after year, which is a huge finding, actually. Next. So in summary, because I've talked probably plenty, big data with an intent to answer certain questions can provide insights into the resource dependencies of these complex urban systems. If you supplement that data with understandings of the regulatory frameworks, the sociodemographic data, detailed understandings of the region's land uses, you can create a much more holistic set of knowledge from which policy can be developed. But you do need to embed that in the larger systems of global flows and regulatory and regulations, trade, and fiscal constraints. Next. So research like this requires the integration of multiple disciplines and methods and frameworks. You need the spatial science and statistics, you need ecology, you need hydrology, energy systems science, and really sociocultural institutional analysis. And then you can reveal the complex institutional blockages to change, and you can identify the places where getting data is more difficult, and then work to get that data and apply that data to solve the problems. But it is still extremely challenging in a siloed and codified system. And the problems of these cities really require this kind of collaborative knowledge synthesis. And it's very difficult to do it in a siloed university system, for one, and to maintain the kinds of focus that's needed to reveal spatial differences across geographies, to understand impacts and inequalities, to reveal the very profound wealth effect, which is probably the biggest driver of flows of all. Next. So obviously the ultimate goal of all of this is to ensure human well-being in the new habitat of humanity's, these cities, coupled with healthy earth systems to support them, and that these new kinds of big data that's specific and granular and that reveals the drivers of the system is deeply necessary, and coupled, I think, with this kind of thick mapping so that you have visual representations and communications, it becomes a very, very useful tool. That's it. Thank you very much for listening to me drone on here.
All right, thank you so much, Stephanie, for that presentation. And with that, we will now have a brief Q&A session. Thank you to those who submitted questions during the presentation. And as a reminder, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box and I will moderate the discussion. So our first question is from Peter Burrell. And the question is, rather than stipulating smaller houses through a size limit or other such regulation, Do you think there are ways to incentivize more sustainable housing choices and consumption by householders as an alternative to energy efficiency programs?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you repeat it?
Sure, of course. So rather than stipulating smaller houses through a size limit or similar regulation, do you think there are other ways to incentivize more sustainable housing choices by householders?
Well, sure. Maybe the price of energy after a certain number of a certain amount becomes extremely expensive. I don't know. I think that it's a very difficult conundrum because people like to point to efficiency as the way to reduce energy use, but efficiency doesn't work if the houses are much bigger. And if you recall the Jevons paradox, essentially when things become more efficient and cheaper, you just tend to use more of it. So I'm not sure you can get at it through efficiency. I think there could be maybe some moral incentives for modesty and parsimony that could help. Um, I think it's a really difficult question.
Okay, and the next question is, when you were creating the Water Hub and Energy Atlas tool, who was the target audience and how do you foresee it being used?
Okay, very good question. So the Energy Atlas is really our primary users tend to be local governments who are under a lot of pressure to do greenhouse gas emissions reporting and to work to reduce energy use in the built environment and in those buildings because of state regulation. So they have been using the Energy Atlas to assess their building stock and to understand relationships between building age and building energy use and the sociodemographic characteristics. We are increasingly partnering with community groups and community partners to help them in their quest for an equitable application of and access to solar resources and helping them navigate some of these complex regulatory issues like the grid capacity and rooftop capacity. So, but I would say the primary user is local government.
Okay, and the next question is, in your investigation of the urban water system of LA, you mentioned the complex nature of it and how fragmented it is. Do you know of other cities also partaking in this sort of comprehensive study, and are you working with any other cities to help implement this sort of data gathering and data analysis?
No. So to answer the first part of the question, I think the Los Angeles region is probably fairly unique for two reasons. One is LA itself is the region is the most densely populated region in the county in the United States, and the historical development of water and delivering entities is fairly unique to California in the way it's this historically accreted system. So in that sense, other metropolitan regions don't necessarily face the same historical evolution, nor the size. But we would be delighted to help any other city implement this kind of research methodology.
Okay, and we will take one final question, and the question is, you mentioned that wealth disparities have a huge impact in the energy and material flows. Are there any policy agendas you wish to see enacted at the city or state level in order to counteract any of the impacts that you've realized through your research?
Well, I think I mentioned a limit on the size of homes, but that's unrealistic, no doubt. I do think that um, these are larger structural questions, and if anybody is familiar with Thomas Piketty's work on inequality and growing inequality under capitalism today, you know that this issue is not isolated to the United States, that we see the concentration of wealth occurring increasingly across the globe. Part of it has to do with taxation structures. Part of it has to do with the way in which wealth is and access to resources is transmitted through wealth. And so it's a very, very big structural issue that has emerged in, if I dare say, late capitalism, or capitalism in the late 20th and early 21st century. So it's beyond simply what we've found here. It's a growing global phenomena. If I may say, yeah, I mean, anybody is welcome to reach me by email. I'm happy to answer further questions if you have them, to go into more detail in some of the presentation materials. I look forward to further engagement and questions and ideas.
And with that, we conclude today's talk on big data and sustainable urban systems. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us today. And to view a recording of this webinar, please visit the member portal of the ISIE website, as well as our ISIE YouTube channel. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.